Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Well, welcome back to the Rural Scoop. I'm Melissa Sadorf, and around here, we believe that the rural advantage is real. When we lead together, our kids and our schools and our communities win. Today, I'm talking with Will Westmoreland, a Missouri farmer and a rural storyteller who founded the Back 40, which is a platform focused on elevating rural voices and organizing for practical solutions. He grew up working his grandparents' place in Southwest Missouri, and he brings decades of on-the-ground experience in rural organizing and community work. And right now, he's taking those stories to Washington, D.C. with a focus on outcomes that matter back home. So, Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I've come from a family of teachers, so it's always good to talk with people in education. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. I did not know that about you. Well, we'll have to make sure that we mention that as well when we're having our conversation. So
you bet.
But I'd really like to start with the why, and that is, what is the Back 40, which I love the name, by the way, and really, what were you trying to do when you launched it?
Well, oddly enough, I came onto social media right before the election last year in the summer, and the reason I did that, Melissa, was I was just kind of fed up with hearing a few things. And one of them was, well, rural America is going to get exactly what it voted for. And, you know, the all abbreviated in politer terms, the whole FAFO mentality. And the other thing that kind of upset me is people didn't really have a good understanding of how rural politics works. You know, we're a very diverse group out here. All of the diversity you see across the country, even though it may not be quite as widespread in rural America, it still exists here. So I told my kids, I'm like, here's my phone, give me a TikTok account. And they set up a TikTok account for me. And I started going out there and posting videos and eventually started doing lives. And for whatever reason, it just took off. And eventually we've grown to about 500,000 followers across all social media. Well, after the election, I was just going to shut it down. I'm like, well, I've said everything I want to say, and I don't know what else I would say. And my kids are like, Dad, you don't know what you're doing. It's like, you don't understand. It takes people years to build up, you know, a following like this. It's like, you got to do something good with this. And I sat around for about a week and I thought about it, Melissa, and I'm like, okay, we really care about rural issues. We know we've got some real problems in the areas of healthcare, education, and ag policy, et cetera. So let's create an organization where we can do a few things. We can go around the country and we can talk to rural people about these issues and how it's impacting them and how bad policy is tied to that. And then we could do advocacy. How can we work to educate lawmakers and larger organizations around the country that deal with these issues, more specifically about rural impacts, et cetera? And that's what we've been doing. I think at last count, I've traveled about around the world 1.5 times if you do the mileage, just traveling all over the country, talking with groups about rural policy and the challenges that we're facing out here with hospital closures and school consolidation and closures and lack of funding and the closing overseas markets for agriculture and that type of thing. And it's just taken off. So we decided our following started reaching out to us and saying, Will, the videos are great. The education is great. We appreciate you coming out to where we live to talk with us. But somebody needs to go to Washington, D.C. and kind of shake these people by the shoulder and tell them they need to start doing something about this. So we planned this event called Save the Heartland from the Heartless, because these policies that are so negatively impacting these three areas that I talked about, they truly are heartless. So we're going to go out there and we're going to do three things. We're going to do meetings with elected officials, hopefully on both sides of the aisle, because we're a nonpartisan group. to talk about education and healthcare and ag policy and economics. We're going to make some social media videos with some really large social media creators telling the personal stories of teachers and students and people with healthcare issues and farmers and ranchers, because the voices that are more powerful than mine out there are the people that are living this every day, telling their personal stories, and then us using our large platforms to broadcast those stories out across the internet. And then the last thing we're doing, we're going to raise a little good trouble. We're going to do some sit-ins while we're out there to focus attention on education and healthcare and poor ag policy. And who knows, maybe through doing a little bit of that good trouble, we'll get more media attention, and that'll give us a bigger platform to be able to talk about these things. So that's the really long elevator speech, Melissa, but that's how this started, and that's what we're hoping to accomplish with the trip. So,
well, that's amazing. And so let's dive into that, the Save the Heartland. Talk to me a little bit about if this is successful, if these are policy makers are really paying attention and we're able to get some movement. What is the difference that this is going to make in the next 6 months or in the next year? What kinds of things would say, okay, you'd look back and you'd say, this was successful because we were able to accomplish this?
Yeah, I think we've got three things happening out there right now, and really all three of them impact education, even though education is one of the three focus areas. All three of the focus areas impact education, and I'll explain how. So if this is successful, I think the immediate thing we would see is we would see a move between now and the end of the year to fully fund the tax credits that go along with the Affordable Care Act. These are really going to cause a lot of damage in rural America. The OBBA bill cut $137 billion from healthcare just in rural America. And if, it's, even though we're nonpartisan, you can't talk about policy without talking about the politicians that pass that policy. So the truth of the matter is they cut $137 billion from rural American healthcare, and then they added back in this $50 billion program, which is operated in two ways. One is $25 billion of it is kind of divided up based on need, state to state. But the other $25 billion, and I'm not trying to be funny here, it's almost like a Hunger Games approach. Every state has to apply in like a contest format for the other $25 billion. And then based on their presentation, that other $25 billion is rewarded out based on that. Well, we all know based on what we're seeing nationally right now that decisions are being motivated by political party. So what are the odds that if somebody from a state like, and I'm just going to say it, a state like Kansas with a Democratic governor, what are the odds if the governor of that state applies for these funds that the U.S. Department of Education is going to allocate those funds if they're looking at it through a political prism rather than a needs prism? So we're really worried about this. And of course, I don't have to tell you, but for your listeners, negative healthcare outcomes really impact education, because sicker kids don't come to school, or even worse, they do come to school and they spread that illness and sickness among the other students and the faculty that work there. So all across states in the country right now, we're seeing, schools in the last cold and flu season, having to close because of the level of sickness that exists in the school. And we're just really, really worried about these things. I think the other outcome in regard to education would be an awareness of how negative this voucher scheme is across the country on public education. I think we're down, you correct me because I'm sure you know this stuff like the back of your hand, but I think we're down to just 17 states that don't have some sort of voucher scheme in place in their state. And and I know, and we need to educate everybody else out there that rural schools are hurt worse than urban and suburban schools when dollars are taken away because of the locked-in transportation costs that they have. So,
Right.
An inner city school may have 10 buses that serve it because most of the kids live, near the school and They've either got a parent drop-off policy or kids can walk to school, that kind of thing. Well, in rural America, there may be 40, 50 buses serving a small school district, and those costs are locked in. The fuel costs are locked in. Some of them try to mitigate that by, hiring people that, own their own buses and that type of thing to drive, but that's still expensive. So a dollar coming out of a rural school, given that they've got fixed costs where they can't shave savings off to make up for that lost dollar, just have a much bigger impact. And and I know also that 80% of the kids that get that money in a school voucher scheme are already in that school. So it just becomes another transference of wealth program versus, kids out here where we live aren't going to get those choices because nobody's going to build a choice, charter school in a town with 53 people. And so it's just a reverse Robin Hood, I call it. So the immediate impact, what would be really positive is that we have a lot more people in rural America that understand these policies and then get engaged in advocacy. So regardless of your political party, you start calling the people that you elected to say, advocate for policies that are good for us in rural America when it comes to healthcare, education, and agriculture.
That's such an important thing to have that grassroots advocacy as part of the ecosystem that you're trying to build.
Right.
You also are going to be talking potentially to staffers when you're in DC. And so how do you translate, a gravel road reality for a staffer who's never ridden, to your point, 45 minutes to school one way? What kind of story do you have to bring in order for them to really understand what's happening in rural America?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer to that is, I know the answer to that is we've got to tell personal stories. If we're honest, what's happening right now because of tribalism and the lines that we've drawn is that people are starting out these conversations on either side with kind of like, you're stupid, let me tell you why, and then I'm going to tell you how to fix your stupidity. And any conversation that starts from that precipice is a failed conversation. So, for instance, when I go out and I talk about healthcare, I don't start out with, you voted for politicians that are costing you your healthcare. What a dumb thing to do. I hurt my arm in a farm accident when I was a kid. I tell that story. I talk about the fact that when I hurt my arm in a farm accident when I was 12 years old, I had to lay out on the ground for 2 hours waiting for an ambulance to show up. And it took almost 3 hours to get to the hospital to be triaged and get the treatment that I needed. Well, 2 years after that happened, we built a rural hospital. And now, because we have an air ambulance and we've got ambulance barns and we've got a closer hospital, if that same accident occurred, it would only take 36 minutes, which is within the golden hour, to get to that critical care that I need. And then I just asked the simple question, do you think we ought to go back to the old system where a 12-year-old kid lays on the ground for 2-3 hours waiting for an ambulance to arrive? And I have yet to have a single person say, you know what, Will, I think we should go back to that old way of doing things. So I think having a teacher come and talk about the fact that they've got to spend so much money out of pocket to cover the expenses for their classroom, or what it means when we go to a 4-day school week, or what it means when school districts have to consolidate, and now teachers and students are on a bus or in a car for 2.5 hours to get to the new school district that they attend or teach at. Those personal stories have an impact that just pointing the finger at somebody doesn't have. So that's what we're going to try to do. And that's why we're so excited to have people from your group, from the National Rural Health Association, from a group called Little Lobbyists, which are parents with severely disabled children. We're bringing them out to go do these visits with us so that we can mediate the social media part of it, but they can tell their personal stories that have a much broader impact.
So important. What is your follow-through plan so that this really isn't just one and done, that this has legs and there's some impact after you're done with the visit?
Well, we're going to do a couple of different things. That's a great question. I can tell you prepared for this interview, so thank you. So that doesn't always happen. So I really appreciate it. We're going to start inviting organizations like yours, teachers, students, healthcare givers, people that are engaged in, there are a lot of people with diabetes and long-term illnesses that are engaged in the rural healthcare system. We're going to start inviting them to attend the events that I've been doing mostly on my own around the country, to tell their personal stories as well. So if I know I'm going to Western Kansas to give a speech about these issues and to do education, we're going to start inviting individuals to tell their stories as part of that process. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to start doing a legislative newsletter where we cover the follow-up that we're doing around the country. What's the legislation out there that's harmful to healthcare, education, and ag policy? Who are the politicians driving that legislation? And what can we do to create activism around either getting them to change their mind or getting people not to follow them in the course of due action? And likewise, on the positive side, we're going to highlight the politicians that are out there, the elected officials that are out there trying to pass legislation that's really good for rural American education, et cetera. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to continue to do these big events like Meet in the Middle, where we go out in rural America and we have people from 8 or 9 counties, hundreds of people coming to these events. And we talk, a lot of people realize the healthcare system is bad, but they don't know why, Melissa. Or they know that their school is consolidating or going to a 4-day week or is having a problem hiring teachers, but they really don't know why. They just know it's happening. So then the rumor mill steps in and fills the gap versus the policy centrist mill, which, explains to them this is what's happening to cause this. So the other thing is we're going to be doing a lot more of these events. They're going to be bigger. And I think we're seeing this trend, too, that we're getting a lot more media coverage. So we're going to have some national media that covers the event in Washington, D.C., and then they've committed to do some of the regional events after that to help, to document what you talked about, the follow-up process and how it's working, getting these politicians, I guess I should call them elected officials, to change their mind.
Well, if you were able to inspire a freshman member of our elected officials, and they ask for a bipartisan starter bill that helps rural kids, where would you point them? What would you ask them to think about putting forward?
The first thing I try to tell, because we have a lot of people that reach out to us that say, Will, I'm running in a district that's primarily urban, but maybe it's 25, 30% rural. And, I don't really understand all the rural issues. Could you do a call with us, a Zoom, just to sit down and walk us through what the key policy issues are in rural America? So we're doing a lot of that right now. And the first thing I tell every politician, regardless of whether what party they're in or if they live in an urban area or a rural area, is I tell them, don't get caught up in the partisanship the minute that you get there. Because the truth of the matter is the Democrats come up with really good ideas for rural America. So do the Republicans, and so do the people who are unaffiliated there. So look at the legislation and judge it based on whether or not it's good for rural America, education, healthcare, and ag policy, and then get behind it regardless of what party's responsible for creating the legislation. And on the other side of that coin is don't be afraid to push back against policies that are bad that have been created by your own party, because you represent the people in your district and not the party that has that initial beside your name. So that's the first thing we most often say. And then what we're trying to do as well, Melissa, is work with organizations like you to say, okay, you're running for office. Go talk to the people who are experts in those fields. Don't just talk to parents, because I was a parent. I raised 4 kids. They all went through 12 years of, pre-K through 12, and then they went to college. But I wasn't an expert on rural education issues while they were going through school. If you would have come to me and said, write a rural education, policy plan, I couldn't have done that. So we got to be careful that we're not just getting feedback from one group, but that we're going to the experts. I know that there are a lot of groups out like yours that have put together some really great plans on how to strengthen rural schools. I know you guys talk about small scale realities. How do you provide minimal funding basis for rural districts and determine, what those financial needs are, and then how do you administer them? I know you guys talk about collaboration, like things extend outside of the school. How do you get with local businesses? How do you talk with the surrounding community about teacher sharing and some of the other really unique ideas that are out there centered around rural education. So I always tell them as well, turn to the experts for this and don't let tribalism, just because a group has supported one party or another doesn't mean they're unwilling to sit down with anyone formulating policy in DC or at the local level to create good policy for education. And then the last thing we say is just don't forget to remember that you don't know everything. Will Rogers, Melissa, once said that it's not what we don't know that hurts us. It's what we think we know that we really don't know that hurts us. And we've just got a lot of elected officials out there, people serving on school boards, all the way up to Congress and the Senate. They think they know about rural education, so they're passing policies based on what they think they know, but what they think they know, they don't know, if that makes sense. So
Yes, it does.
we just try to stress that. Turn to the experts. Yes, engage parents, but engage teachers and administrators and people that have worked in the field. And if you do that, you can't go wrong. And then the last thing I want to say is we just can't ignore the funding problem anymore. We ask our teachers and our administrators in education across the board, not just rural education, to do a lot. And we just can't ignore the fact anymore that our schools are underfunded. That's just the bottom line. I mean, becoming a teacher should not be the same as helping out at your local food bank. And I know that's a crass way to put it, but it's not a charity, it's a job. And the person that is fulfilling that role needs to be able to pay their bills. And I can't tell you how many times I hear, well, we really push in our district to get people that are married to somebody with a good job so that they can teach and not have to worry about that. And I'm just like, that is such a broken approach right from the beginning. If you want to get really good qualified teachers, then pay them a salary that allows them to do their job and pay their bills. What a unique concept. So addressing the funding issue is critical as well.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. So, you talked about these policymakers whose area, their congressional district, may not be all rural. There might be some urban or suburban interests that they're representing as well. But can you talk a little bit, Will, about where you see rural and urban interests naturally align? And how do we name that common ground on purpose so that we can use it in our conversations with those elected officials?
Yeah, there's a unique dynamic happening out there that I never thought of before, so I can't take credit for this. I've just talked to educators in the field and I've talked to healthcare providers in the field, and there's this really odd dynamic that happens that causes the failures in rural education to result in increased burdens in urban education and suburban education. And let me explain what I mean. So if you can imagine either a school or a hospital in rural America having this perimeter drawn around it, and the clinic or the hospital draws in patients from this perimeter, and the school does the same thing. It draws in students and educators from the same perimeter. Well, when something breaks from a policy perspective inside that perimeter, let's say that a school has a hard time hiring teachers because of lack of funding, or a school district has to merge with another school district. And now all of a sudden, the students in that perimeter, instead of going to that local school, have to drive to this perimeter 3 hours away on a bus to go to school. What happens is people start moving away from those rural communities because moms are always going to be moms. If they can't get good health care for their kids and they can't get a good education for their kids, or there's an increase in crime because of lack of opportunity, moms are always going to do the same thing. If they can afford it, they're going to move their kids to where the opportunities are. And that's happening at a grand scale in rural America right now. So for the last 2 decades, we've had a record number of migration from the top 400 rural counties in this country into suburban and urban areas, just based on better job opportunities, better education opportunities, and better health care. And that creates a burden, because when urban and suburban schools are planning for the number of students they're going to have for a year, if a rural school district goes out of business, typically people will move to the closest urban area, and it creates a student influx that results in funding issues and things like that. So I do think from that argument perspective, it's really good for urban and suburban schools to work with their friends in rural education to help make sure that those kinds of things don't happen. How can we do that? I think that, the teacher share idea is a way where that could be done, where better funded urban and suburban school districts could do teacher lending to urban school districts to help meet the needs for lack of staffing in those rural schools. If it's done on a collaborative basis and it's not forced, it ends up being a really good thing, because there are a lot of younger teachers, especially, that work in suburban areas that are, they view it almost as the Lord's work to go out to these rural areas and to do teaching opportunities out there, to tutor kids after their regular school day. But, we need to pay them for that. So I think the compensation needs to be a part of that, so they're getting paid for that. I think creating incentive programs for teachers that there are a lot of teachers in urban and suburban schools that grew up in rural America and would love nothing more than to move back to their local rural town and to be able to teach there, but they can't do it because of the harsh realities of economics. So I think creating incentives for teachers who serve in rural areas, doing loan forgiveness, doing housing stipends, offering professional development support, not only for those teachers that want to move to fill those gaps, but also for the teachers that live there, are critically important. And then I also think that we could do a better job of expanding the perimeter for our partnerships with businesses, et cetera, in urban and suburban areas, because there are a lot of really talented students out in rural America. And I think here in Missouri, we do have some good programs where in the technical career field, we bring students from rural Missouri into our larger urban centers to get technical training, VOAG and technical training, and that's done in these urban areas. And it's paid for, the transportation is paid for by the state. So I think anything we can do where we've already got these urban power centers with a lot of students participating in specific training that we can't recreate in urban areas, then let's create a system where we fund bringing those students once a week, twice a week, whatever it might be, especially as they progress toward graduation into these urban areas to get that education a couple of days a week. So the good news is I don't think there are a lack of programs and ideas out there. I just think there's a real lack of focus on behalf of our elected officials to be creative and work with the people that understand these programs to produce these new avenues of education that would be good for everybody.
Yeah, that's very well said. Will, can you, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to rely on you. Can you talk a little bit about how the healthcare system really tracks with the education system in a rural community where one is suffering, the other ultimately suffers as well? And some of the things that we're talking about with education really are the same kinds of conversations that people in the healthcare field are also having as it relates to rural. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I sure can. So the biggest dynamic is the one I talked about, and that's migration from rural America into urban and suburban America because of a lack of good health care. So the very first decision that a mom has to make when she becomes pregnant in rural America is, do I live in an OBGYN desert? Am I going to be able to get good prenatal care? Because we know good prenatal care reduces the risk that you have a pregnancy that ends in problems later on. Here's the 57-year-old farmer telling the women out there something they already know. But for all you men watching, I'm going to give you an education here. But it creates these healthcare deserts. So the very first decision a mom has to make is, do I stay here where I live in rural America, and do I drive an hour and a half to get good prenatal care? And lots of times mom make the very rational decision to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to live in an area where if there's a problem or something goes wrong during this 9 months, I can get to healthcare quickly and I can get to good healthcare. That results in migration. She takes the other 2 kids with her when the family moves. And now we've got a lack of funding because we've lost 2 pupils and a possible third pupil in that school district. And we all know that lots of rural school funding is based on the number of kids that are in a school and not just on keeping that school open. And those decisions just continue on even after the child is born. Do I have a pediatrician in my community? In rural America, lots of times the answer to that question is no, there's not one. So now you're in the same boat. My son one night comes into my room when he's 9 years old and he says, Dad, my stomach really hurts. The next morning, because he was miserable all night, I take him to the doctor. He's got a burst appendix. And they're
Oh,
like, we need to get him to the children's hospital immediately. Well, from the point that decision was made to the point he was in the ER getting pain relief and getting the treatment that he needed was only like 23 minutes. Well, in rural America, that could be a couple of hours.
yeah.
Again, mom makes the decision. Once my child arrives, I want good health care for them. If that's not going to be there, maybe it results in migration away from that rural area. And it just goes on and on and on, all the way to the point where even if you don't have good long-term elderly care, then families will make the decision to move so that they can get mom or dad or grandpa into really good long-term care, and they want to live near them in order to be able to, to visit and advocate for them in that long-term health care, et cetera. So that's the biggest thing, is we're just losing people in rural America, and it's not being driven by the fact that they don't want to live there or they don't love living there or that they don't like the rural experience. It's being driven by the fact that financially it's hard to find good jobs. It's hard to get good health care. And as the schools have to close and merge and consolidate as a result of that lack of funding, they don't want to drive 2 hours to get their kids there. But yeah, the patterns are the same. So anytime you starve any organization of funding, it's going to result in a loss of services. And that pattern, to your point, Melissa, is the same in education as it is in healthcare. If we don't make it a priority from a policy perspective to fund education and healthcare, then those local hospitals close, as do the rural schools. It's more difficult to get specific treatment. So if you have diabetes or kidney issues or cancer care is needed, it's almost the same thing as an individual education plan in education. If you don't have the funding to create those, people move away because they can't get the services they need. They're tied very close together because of a quality of life perspective.
Very well said. So you have policy in one lane, but you also have local voice in the other, and you're navigating both. So can we talk a little bit, Will, about how communities can build that voice back home without the shouting, preferably? But what's your playbook for a solutions first community forum or community gathering that really earns trust? What's the format or ground rules, or how would you structure that?
I'm really glad you asked that question, Melissa, because I do think rural schools are different than urban and suburban schools in the role they play in a rural community. They're much more than just classrooms. In many cases, the school, along with the churches, are the cornerstone of a rural community. And so much of community life in rural America is built around that. They're not only the catalyst for interaction. I grew up on a farm where when I was a kid, I had to walk more than a mile to the closest farm kid that lived out where I lived in order just to shoot a few hoops around the basket. So the school became the place with the basketball games and the baseball games and the little ag festivals that we did and that kind of thing. That became the gathering point for the community, where people could get together and show civic pride and pride of school and interact and talk. There were probably more marriage proposals, farm sales, cows being bought at the Friday night football game than anywhere else in rural America, just as a result of that. So that's a really, really good point. And I think that the other impact it has is a strong economic impact. Because if you look at the data in rural America, the number of kids that go into the workforce straight out of high school is a lot higher in rural America than it is in urban and suburban America. So we're asking our rural schools to do a lot. In our urban and suburban schools, in many cases, those kids are going to get another 2 years, to an associate's degree, or another 4 years to an undergraduate degree, to kind of learn the ropes in regard to getting out into the workplace and getting a better job because of that. We're asking our grade schools and high schools in rural America to prepare a student so that at the point they graduate at the age of 18, they're prepared to go into, quote unquote, the real world. And I think that's another differentiator that a lot of policymakers don't think about, often enough. So I do think that focus needs to be there as well. We need to understand the criticality of the impact a K through 12 school has on the local community. And we need to fund it, based on that criticality, which means, some of the programs we would normally see at a 2-year college in a city, maybe some of that needs to be built into that K through 12 curriculum at a local rural school, or at least at a minimum, do what I talked about before, put those kids that are going to go into those VOAG blue collar careers on a bus once a week and take them to those VOAG schools in town to let them learn some of that while they're in high school so that they can enter the job market with those skill sets in place. So it's just a whole unique, different set of challenges that are faced. And I know if I was a teacher, I would be so frustrated because I just talk to them all the time and they're like, I just can't get, sometimes they say I can't get my administrator to understand the differences, or lots of times it's I can't get my parents to understand, the difference, but the teachers get it. So we're really trying to encourage legislators to talk to teachers. And that's why we're telling these personal stories.
Mm. What do you do when the room gets a little bit spicy? Because, conversations can get heated. What are some of the techniques that have been successful for you that really lower the temperature without losing the honesty of the conversation?
Yeah. And, sometimes I think it's okay for it to be spicy as long as the disrespect doesn't overwhelm the policy discussion. And I think, anytime I go out and speak, like my favorite thing to do is I like to go out into rural areas and talk to a big crowd of people where maybe 80 or 90% of them may not agree with what I have to say coming into the room. And nothing makes me happier than when I'm done speaking to have a group of people come up to me afterwards and say, you know what? They either change their mind, or even if they just tell me, I've never had anybody come talk to me about this and not tell me I'm stupid, but actually had a really honest conversation with me about how, regardless of whether I'm a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, this is how education and healthcare and agriculture policy impact me and my family personally. So I think that's the key thing is when you talk about personal stories, I think I ask questions like this all the time when it comes to education. Before I even start talking about it, I'll say, listen, when I was in my little rural school, I was a really good debater because I grew up with two sisters and a mom. So I was in a household full of women, and I mastered the art of the argument, in defending myself against the onslaught. All right. And I became pretty good at debate. And I had a rural teacher in 7th grade that said, Will, walk down to Miss Paget's class and sign up for speech and debate. I went to my first tournament when I was a freshman in high school, and I won all 5 of my rounds and went on to win 4th place in that tournament. Now, Melissa, you'll appreciate this because you've seen students like this before. Here's what I wore to that debate tournament. I had an old pair of my brother's corduroy pants that I rolled up and duct taped on the inside so that they looked like they were hemmed. And about halfway through the day, the black electrical tape started creeping its way, through the bottom of the hem. I had on one of my grandpa's dress shirts. I called it the flare collar from like the 1970s, and a paisley tie that he had. And then I had a jacket, I think that had been my uncle's dress jacket that looked like one of those like pre-Civil War Abe Lincoln long coats. And that's what I wore. So I get home from this tournament after winning 4th place. And on Sunday, my mom gets a call and I hear her sitting there and she's like, oh, hi, Mrs. Harris. Oh, yes, Mrs. Harris. We'll be there, Mrs. Harris. So on Monday, we go down to the local clothing store in my little town, and there are 12 of the sourest old ladies with silver hair you've ever seen in your life, and they're all wearing red jackets and red hats. Well, I didn't know what the red hat ladies were, but for those of you that don't know, don't make that mistake, because in rural America, in a lot of cases, they're the backbone of the community. But the serious part of this is they bought me 2 suits. They bought me a black pair of dress shoes, a brown pair of dress shoes. They bought me 2 belts. They bought me a leather briefcase. And I'll never forget, as I was walking out the door with my arms full, Burl Harris, who, God bless her, she's passed away now. She was the speech and debate coach at the high school. She came up and she always called me Willie because my sisters and my mom called me Willie. She goes, Willie Westmoreland, when you go out of this town to another school or to another community, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing your town and the people that live here. So they made an investment in me. And anytime I went to the Nationals when I was a sophomore, I won 3rd place in the nation in Lincoln Douglas debate, and my little rural school found the money for me to fly down to San Antonio, Texas, to spend a week there debating. And they did that for 3 years while I was in high school. And they just made an investment in me that ended up getting me a full ride to college in speech. And those speaking skills that I learned have helped me throughout my entire life. So I'll ask the question, Melissa, I'll say, do you think a kid that goes to a rural school shouldn't get those opportunities just because of where they were born and where they were raised? And again, what person is going to say, yeah, I think that that should happen? There might be one or two just Fruit Loops out on the edge of society that might say that. But the vast majority of people are going to say, no, I think my kid or my son or my granddaughter in rural America should get the same opportunities. And once we agree on that, talking about the policy becomes a joint constructed discussion. That's how you do it. Personal stories, stress the personal stories, stress the fairness and equity of everybody in rural America getting a fair check, a fair shake in these areas. And it's been my experience anyway that takes a lot of the heat out of the room. It takes a lot of the confrontation out of the room. And now all of a sudden you've got a room full of collaborators that do what you did. They say, Will, what do we do next?
Yep. Well, you can't argue with somebody's personal narrative.
Right. You can, but you don't look good doing it.
Well, that's true. That is true.
Yeah.
So you mentioned ag policy, and that's something that I don't have a lot of experience with. I grew up in rural Arizona, and ag was not in my area. We had cattle. So can you talk a little bit about the ag policy that is really something you're focused on right now?
Yeah, so agriculture is a huge part of rural America. And hey, you did grow up in an ag area because those cattle
That's
are part
true.
of agriculture. So
They are.
You are a rural girl. Wear that with a badge of pride. So no, in rural America, even though only about 13 to 16% of the people that live there are farmers, it can make up as much as 60% of the GDP. So almost all the businesses in a rural community, the local store, the local insurance agency, the feed store, all the little stores and retail outlets that pop up in a rural community are typically driven about 60% by the dollars that are earned on the farm. And then that gets circulated through the community 5 to 7 times. So a dollar spent when you sell cattle or you sell corn or soybeans, that typically rotates through the community 5 to 7 times. So it has a huge impact. Well, right now things are bad. And again, going back to what I said about you can't talk about bad policy without talking about the elected officials that are passing it. These tariffs have been really bad for rural agriculture. To give you an example, during President Trump's first term, the Chinese were only buying about 13% of their row crops, meaning corn and soybeans and barley and this type of thing, from Brazil. But when we put those tariffs in place, it really hurt the Chinese. That's 1 billion Chinese bellies over there that were being filled with American corn, soybean, barley, etc. And it really hurt them because they had a big disease going through their pork population at the time. They didn't have any storages of row crops to the degree that they needed them. Well, one thing about the Chinese is they're kind of like we are. They don't just sit around and wait for another problem to happen. They immediately went out and said, okay, where can we source these agricultural items from other places? And they have spent hundreds of millions, some people would say billions of dollars down in South America, burning down the rainforest, creating new railway lines to get the crops that are being grown where the rainforest used to be to harbors that have been dug out and have been completely renovated to get these big grain transporters in there. And they went from buying 13% of their row crop agricultural products from Brazil to now buying almost 40%. And those markets are probably never going to come back short of us having an administration and a political class that's willing to sit down with the Chinese and negotiate better deals. Now, there'll be a lot of people that watch this that say, well, we just did that. We got this great soybean deal. Well, what this deal does, the Chinese are going to buy 14 billion metric tons of soybeans this year. That's about 15 billion less than what they normally do. And then going forward, they're going to be buying about 5 billion less per year than what they normally do. But the other piece of it is there's no teeth in this plan. So normally when you do any kind of a trade deal, you've got something written in there where if America breaks their word or, China breaks their word, there's a penalty. Well, there are no penalties in this deal. So if the Chinese can get beans cheaper from, Argentina or Brazil, they can just do that. And there's no penalty for not buying the number of beans that they claimed they were going to, buy for us. So what this has led to is it's led to probably this year, if we don't have a huge farmer bailout, we're probably looking at the highest level of bankruptcies we've ever had since the 1980s farm crisis. Some agricultural economists think it could be as high as 21 to 23% of farmers. And that's going to have a negative impact on all of us because it's going to impact the food supply. It's going to cause prices to go up. And I know I can just collectively hear people out there saying, well, they're getting what they voted for. But what we know about the food supply being impacted is it's not going to be those farmers that voted the way they did to get hurt the worst. It's going to be kids like me that grew up poor, that were on food stamps, and we already see it with SNAP. They're the ones that are going to be impacted by this, and elderly people that have a hard time purchasing the food that they need, et cetera. And then anytime you can't sell your products, you don't make a profit. So those dollars don't go through the community 5 to 7 times. And you start to see that local boutique that's been doing well for the last 30 years, all of a sudden it closes. Maybe the feed store goes to 4 days a week instead of 6. And you just start to see this, this sprawl happen out there. And that's why now when you drive through so many small towns, you see businesses closed. The ceilings are caving in on the buildings in the old downtown. So they're just so intricately tied together that if one fails, the other fails. And when our rural ag fails, that causes the schools to be underfunded. They begin to fail, to close, to lose teachers. Now you've got students coming out that aren't prepared to be the business people they need to be when they operate their farms and ranches. So they can't be effective business people, which is a core part of being a farmer or rancher in this country. So it's that vicious cycle, that cyclical failure that creeps into the system. So all of it's related to each other. And that's why I talk about all three. We need better healthcare, we need better education, and we need better economic policy. And it begins with funding all of those things.
So, Will, what are the simple next steps for our friends that are listening in their truck or their office or their school kitchen? What do they need to think about doing?
Well, the first thing I want to say is put aside the political partisanship and look at all of this from the perspective of what is good policy and what isn't. The other thing we've got to quit doing is thinking that just because we go out and Google something, it makes us an expert. It doesn't. We can get a high level, superficial understanding of a topic by Googling it and looking up on the internet, but doing your own research is the worst way in the world to pass good policy. If you want to know about good education policy, go talk to teachers and administrators and people that specialize in education economics and develop good policy based on what they tell you the needs are. When did being a teacher become a bad word? When did being a first responder or a doctor or a nurse become a bad word? It's the conspiracy theories, the politicization, this idea that we think we can do a 15-minute search on the internet and all of a sudden we know more than a teacher does or an administrator that's been in the education system for 20 years. We've got to put that stuff aside and we've got to inject common sense back into the process. So the first thing I would tell people is you're not an expert, but rely on the experts to formulate good policy. If you do that, you can't go wrong. The second thing I want to say is if you want to help us advocate, and listen, I want to tell everybody right up front, we don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. If you believe in good policy for rural America, we will help you as somebody running for office. So the second thing I want to say is get engaged. We got a lot of retired teachers out there that would make great state representatives. They would make great state senators. They would make great Congress people. Hell, maybe even a president. So get engaged, start running for office and advocate for these things that you believe in. Don't believe this idea that because you were a teacher for 25 years, you shouldn't be involved in politics or your voice shouldn't be heard. You should be the loudest. You should be at the top of the mound telling the rest of us that know less of you than you do how this works. And then finally, if I could be so bold, if you want to support what we're doing in Washington, D.C. to advocate for these things, you can go to savetheheartland.org, savetheheartland.org, and you can learn about this event that we're carrying off in Washington, D.C., and you can donate there. You can click on the link to volunteer, and you can get involved in different ways with the Back 40 Action. This organization, it's a C4 nonprofit. Your contributions are tax deductible, and we really are doing critical work in rural America. And we've got Republicans, Democrats, independents, people that say, I want to have nothing to do with politics at all. All of those types of people follow us and engage and get involved in what we're trying to do.
Fantastic. Well, Will, I have one last question, and I
You bet.
ask it of all of my guests, and that is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Well, to me, when I just think about it at the top level, I think I would say, first of all, I'm sad that being from rural America right now can be a disadvantage for a kid coming out of school or somebody with a healthcare issue, that type of thing, because of the fact that our services are failing us in rural America. For me, rural advantage, the way I grew up and what I experienced in my own personal education, et cetera, is that our schools and our doctors and our clinics, et cetera, and our FFA and the things that were centered around our agricultural growth in rural America, all those things were just bastions of the community coming together to do what's best for a student, to do what's best for the health of a community. And those smaller communities always resulted in closer relationships that resulted in good conversations, that resulted in us electing people that cared about making it better for us here in rural America. And we all played a role in that. Parents volunteer at the schools, grandparents volunteer at the schools, people raise money for the local food bank. Everybody comes together when a farmer loses all their round bales, and they all pitch in to replace that hay so that they can get through, a season. When somebody has cancer in their family, we all come together. I think I could make a critical argument that has happened better in rural America over the decades and the centuries than anywhere else in the country. And all I'm trying to do out here with the help of 400,000 people that follow us is just get us back to where we were and make it even better. So that's what it means for me.
I love that answer. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Well,
You bet.
I want to thank you for spending time with me today and for, really carrying rural places into rooms where decision gets made. Because your stories and your information remind us that rural isn't a talking point. It's lived reality, with students on bus routes that are long and clinic schedules that might be shortened because of what's happening on the ground, and shop classes that may or may not roll out next year because of funding. So I really appreciate you spending some time with me today and talking through not only what you're going to be doing with the Back 40, but your trip to DC and the Save the Heartland, which I hope people take a look at on the website that you've mentioned.
No, I appreciate it. My grandmother was a teacher and a librarian, and every summer I would go visit her for a month. And I have to tell you, especially when I went through my farm accident as a child, I was really discouraged, as you can imagine, being disfigured in an early age and what you had to deal with. Thankfully, I was a really big kid, so there wasn't a lot of bullying, but it was still just your personal self-image and that type of thing. And I don't know, my grandmother was like my North Star. I would go visit her. She was a teacher and a librarian, and we would read, and we'd go to Shakespeare in the park and all the other thing that teachers force you to do. And much to my chagrin, over the years, I learned to love all of that stuff. And I know the advantages it gave me over time because I had a teacher in my life. I had an aunt who was a teacher, and my mom's cousin who was like a sister to her and an aunt to me was an art teacher in rural America. And teachers have just had a huge impact on me and in my kids' life. I was a single dad. I raised 3 sons and a daughter by myself. And I got to tell you, teachers were some of the first people to step up and say, Will, this is going to be hard, but you can do it. And they were right there beside me, offering me help, never judged me when I didn't get a daily parent signature done, or when I didn't show up to pick the kids up from school on time because I was racing from one place to another. They were always the first to pat me on the back and say, hey, keep plugging away, Will, you're doing a good job. So love teachers, love working with them, and really appreciate you having me on today.
Oh, really appreciate your time. So friends, if Will's work resonates, make sure that you check out the Back 40 and Save the Heartland. Those links will be in our show notes. Make sure you invite him to your community forum or borrow an idea and make it your own. And if you host a conversation, make sure that you tell us, especially tell Will what happened. I'm sure he loves hearing wins and lessons learned as much as we do. So if this episode helped you, please like, subscribe, and follow The Rural Scoop on your favorite podcast app. And please leave a quick rating or a review, because that's how more rural voices find us. Share this episode with a neighbor who cares about kids' clinics in Main Street, because around here, we believe that the rural advantage is real, and it grows when we move together. So I'm Melissa Sadorf, and thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to The Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at @msadorf1, and X at @msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.